My name is Gloria, and at 35 years old, I never imagined I'd be standing in a funeral home staring at my husband's coffin while my sister claimed her son was his child. Marcus had been gone for just 3 days when Stephanie walked in with 12-year-old Tommy and destroyed everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Before I share what happened next, please let me know where you're watching from. If this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe to support my journey through this painful truth. The morning sunlight streamed through our Victorian home's bay windows as Marcus kissed me goodbye for what would be the last time. We'd been married for 15 years, and every single day felt like a blessing I never took for granted. Marcus was 42, a successful architect who designed buildings that touched the sky, but he always said I was his greatest achievement. We met at Boston University when I was 20, and he was 27, both reaching for coffee at the same campus cafe during finals week. His hand touched mine as we both grabbed for the last blueberry muffin, and he smiled that crooked smile that would become my whole world. Our life in the Massachusetts suburbs was everything we'd dreamed of during those late-night study sessions. Marcus would sketch our future home on napkins, while I graded papers for my education degree. Now, 15 years later, I taught third grade at Riverside Elementary, coming home each day to find Marcus in his home office, classical music playing softly as he worked on his latest project. We'd tried for children for 7 years before accepting that parenthood wasn't in our cards. The fertility treatments had taken their toll emotionally and physically, but Marcus held me through every negative test, every failed procedure, whispering that I was enough, that we were enough. My sister Stephanie never understood our contentment. 4 years younger than me at 31, she'd always viewed my life through envious eyes. Where I found joy in simple moments, she saw missed opportunities. Where I saw a loving partnership, she saw a life she deserved more than I did. Her marriage to Paul had crumbled 3 years ago, leaving her to raise Tommy alone in a cramped apartment downtown. Marcus, being the generous soul he was, helped them constantly. Monthly checks for Tommy's school supplies, surprise groceries deliveries when Stephanie's hours at the restaurant were cut, even paying for Tommy's baseball equipment when Stephanie mentioned he'd made the team. I noticed how Stephanie's demeanor changed around Marcus. Her usual sharp edges softened, her bitter complaints about life transformed into light laughter. She knew things about his schedule that surprised me, mentioning his client meetings before I did, knowing when he'd be working late. When I asked Marcus about it, he'd shrug and say he probably mentioned it when she called about Tommy's needs. She had his direct office line, his personal cell, even knew the passcode to his phone, because she'd needed to use it once when hers died during Tommy's emergency room visit for a broken arm. The Thursday before everything changed, Stephanie had stopped by unexpectedly. Marcus was at a client dinner and she seemed disappointed to find only me home. She wandered through our house, running her fingers along the marble countertops, staring at our wedding photos with an expression I couldn't quite read. Tommy sat quietly in our living room, a boy who looked nothing like his father Paul, but had these striking green eyes that seemed familiar somehow. Stephanie mentioned she'd been to Marcus's office earlier that week to drop off some papers he'd offered to notarize for her. The secretary knew her by name. She laughed, saying she was practically family. Friday started like any other day. Marcus left early for a site inspection in Worcester, texting me heart emojis from the car like he always did. I spent the day teaching my third graders about butterflies, their life cycle of transformation. The irony wasn't lost on me later, how I'd stood at that whiteboard explaining how something could completely change form and become unrecognizable. At 3:15, I was cleaning up construction paper wings when my phone rang. The principal's face appeared in my doorway moments later, her expression telling me everything before the words came. There had been an accident on Route 9. A truck had crossed the median. Marcus was being rushed to Massachusetts General. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights ignored and prayers screamed at a God I wasn't sure was listening. I ran through those sterile hallways, my teacher's flats squeaking against the polished floors, hope dying with each step closer to the trauma unit. The doctor, a young woman with kind eyes and steady hands, met me at the doors. She didn't need to speak. The way her shoulders dropped the gentle hand on my arm the soft chair she guided me to, it all said what her words would confirm. Marcus had died on the operating table. Internal injuries too severe. They'd done everything possible. I don't remember screaming, but they told me later that security had to come. I don't remember calling anyone, but somehow Stephanie appeared holding me as I sobbed into her shoulder, my fingers clutching Marcus's wedding ring that the nurse had placed in my palm. It was still warm, as if he'd just taken it off to wash his hands like he did every night before bed. Stephanie handled the calls I couldn't make, contacted the funeral home, even picked out the casket when I stood frozen in the showroom, unable to process that I was shopping for a box to put my husband in. The next 3 days passed in a haze of decisions that felt both monumentally important and completely meaningless. What flowers would Marcus have wanted? Did it matter? He wouldn't see them. What songs should play at the service? He wouldn't hear them. I moved through the preparations like a ghost myself, Stephanie surprisingly efficient at managing details, while I could barely remember to eat. She brought Tommy over each day, saying he wanted to help, though he mostly sat silently near me, occasionally reaching out to pat my hand with a gentleness that seemed beyond his 12 years. The funeral home filled with hundreds of people whose faces blurred together through my tears. Marcus's colleagues spoke of his brilliant mind and generous mentorship. Clients shared stories of how he'd gone above and beyond, designing not just buildings, but dreams. Our friends from college remembered the man who'd tutored half the campus for free, who'd once spent his last $20 on pizza for a study group instead of gas for his car. Everyone had a Marcus story, each one another knife in my chest, another reminder of all I'd lost. I stood at the podium, my prepared speech forgotten, and instead spoke from my shattered heart. I told them about the man who left love notes in my lunch bag after 15 years, who still called me beautiful when I had the flu, who spent 6 months learning to bake because I'd mentioned once that I missed my grandmother's apple pie. I told them about the Marcus who cried during animated movies, who rescued spiders instead of killing them, who read to elderly residents at the nursing home every Sunday, even though no one knew because he never mentioned it. I told them about my Marcus, the one only I knew completely, the one I'd never hold again. The burial was private, just family and closest friends. I watched them lower him into the ground, this man who'd been my everything, and wondered how I was supposed to continue existing in a world where he didn't. People filed past offering condolences that felt hollow promises to check on me that I knew they'd forget within weeks. That's how grief works, I was learning. It's unbearable for those inside it, and uncomfortable for those outside it, creating a chasm that grows wider with each passing day. As the crowd thinned, Stephanie remained dressed inappropriately in a red dress she claimed was the only formal thing she owned. Tommy stood beside her, and I noticed then how he'd been crying harder than anyone except me, his young face swollen and blotchy. He'd mumbled something at the casket that sounded like Dad, but I was too lost in my own pain to process it. Now, as the cemetery workers waited patiently for us to leave so they could finish their work, Stephanie gripped my arm with urgency. She pulled me into the funeral home's private family room, Tommy trailing behind us like a shadow. The space smelled of lilies and lemon polish. Afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows that painted rainbow patterns across the beige carpet. Stephanie's hands shook as she closed the door, checking twice that it was fully shut. Tommy sat in the corner, his shoulders hunched, staring at his sneakers as if they held the secrets of the universe. "Gloria, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen completely before you react," Stephanie began, her voice different from any tone I'd heard her use before. It wasn't her usual defensive sharp edge or the fake sweetness she employed when asking for money. This was something raw, desperate, almost frightened. I sank into one of the overstuffed chairs, my black dress pooling around me, still clutching the funeral program with Marcus's smiling face on the cover. That photo was from last summer at Cape Cod. His skin sun-kissed, his eyes crinkled with joy. We'd been celebrating his biggest project approval champagne on the beach at sunset. 9 months ago, he'd been invincible. Now he was 6 feet under cold earth. "Tommy is Marcus's son." Stephanie said the words, falling into the room like stones into still water. The program slipped from my fingers, floating to the floor in slow motion. I stared at my sister, waiting for the punchline to this sick joke. But her face remained serious, tears starting to stream down her carefully made-up cheeks. Tommy lifted his head then, and in the afternoon light those familiar green eyes looked back at me. Marcus's eyes. How had I never seen it before? "That's impossible," I whispered, but even as I said it, my mind was racing backward through time. 13 years ago. Tommy was 12. 13 years ago, Marcus and I had been going through our rough patch, the only time in our relationship we'd separated. 6 months apart, while we figured out if love was enough to bridge our differences about his career ambitions and my desire to stay near family. "During your separation," Stephanie continued as if reading my thoughts, "you were staying with Mom in Florida trying to decide if you wanted to save the marriage. Marcus was alone, devastated, drinking too much. I went to check on him one night. One thing led to another. The room spun around me. My sister. My husband. While I was crying myself to sleep 5 states away, wondering if our marriage could survive his workaholic tendencies, they were together. Every therapy session Marcus and I had attended, every tear we'd shed, rebuilding our trust, every promise we'd made to always be honest, all of it built on a lie so fundamental, it made everything else meaningless. We agreed never to tell anyone," Stephanie said quickly. "Marcus was horrified afterward. He loved you so much, Gloria. It was one night, one terrible mistake. When I found out I was pregnant, Paul and I had just gotten back together after our own break. The timing worked out. Everyone believed Tommy was Paul's. Marcus knew." My voice came out strangled, unrecognizable. Stephanie nodded, pulling out her phone with trembling fingers. "He's known from the beginning. Here." She showed me photograph after photograph. Marcus holding infant Tommy in what looked like a hospital room. Marcus at a park pushing a toddler on a swing. Marcus teaching a young boy to throw a baseball. Pictures I'd never seen, moments I'd never known existed, a parallel life running alongside the one I thought we shared. "All those times he helped you financially," I said, understanding flooding through me like poison. "He insisted on supporting his son. Not publicly, but he never missed anything important. School plays, baseball games, science fairs. He was there for all of it. You thought he was working late or meeting clients. Sometimes he was, but sometimes he was being a father to Tommy." Tommy spoke then, his young voice cracking. "He told me last month he was going to tell you everything. He said he couldn't live with the secret anymore. He wanted to be my real dad, not just Uncle Marcus." I stood abruptly, needing distance from this revelation. Outside the window, people were leaving the cemetery, getting into their cars to return to their normal lives, while mine disintegrated. 15 years of marriage. 7 years of fertility treatments, while Marcus already had a child. Every negative pregnancy test I'd sobbed over while he comforted me, knowing he'd already experienced fatherhood with my sister. "I want a DNA test," I said flatly. "Of course," Stephanie agreed immediately. "I expected that. But Gloria, there's something else." My laugh was bitter hollow. "Something else. What could possibly be worse?" She reached into her purse, pulling out a manila envelope that looked official, important. "Marcus changed his will 6 months ago. He left provisions for Tommy. Significant provisions. The funeral director knocked softly, asking if we needed more time. I told him yes, though what I wanted was to run from this room, from these truths, from the ruins of my life." Stephanie handed me the envelope, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Not yet. Not while my husband's body was still warm in the ground, not while the flowers on his casket were still fresh. "We'll deal with this later," I managed to say, moving toward the door. "Gloria, wait," Stephanie called. "I know you hate me right now. You have every right to. But Marcus loved you more than anything. What happened between us, it wasn't love. It was loneliness and mistake and too much wine. You were his world. Always." I turned to look at her. This sister who'd shared my childhood, who'd been my maid of honor, who'd held my hair when morning sickness from fertility drugs made me retch. "You were my sister," I said simply. He was my husband, and you both lied to me every single day for 13 years. Walking out of that room, leaving them behind, I felt something inside me shift. The grief was still there, crushing and absolute, but now it was mixed with rage so pure it made my vision blur. Marcus was gone, taking any chance for confrontation or explanation with him. But Stephanie was here, and she'd have to face what came next. 3 days after the funeral, I sat in the law office of Harrison and Associates, the firm Marcus and I had used for all our legal matters. Robert Harrison had been Marcus's friend since college, someone I trusted implicitly. The original will was in my hands, the one Marcus and I had created together 5 years ago. Simple, straightforward everything to the surviving spouse. We joked during that meeting about updating it when we had kids. Both of us still hopeful, despite years of disappointments. The office door opened and Stephanie walked in with a man I didn't recognize. He was younger than Harrison, wearing an expensive suit that seemed trying too hard to impress. He introduced himself as Daniel Baker, Stephanie's attorney, and I wondered where she'd gotten money for legal representation. Harrison's expression tightened slightly at Baker's presence until I recognized from years of dinner parties where he'd discussed difficult opposing counsel. "Mrs. Morrison," Baker began before even sitting down, "we're here to discuss the amended last will and testament of Marcus Morrison dated 6 months ago." Harrison frowned, looking at me. "Gloria, were you aware of any changes to the estate planning?" I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. Stephanie pulled out a document from her designer bag, another thing she couldn't afford, sliding it across the mahogany table. The header was correct, Marcus's full legal name, our address, all the proper formatting of a legal document. But the date made my stomach churn. 6 months ago was when Marcus had started acting strangely, working even later hours, taking mysterious phone calls, being protective of his laptop. Harrison put on his reading glasses, examining the document carefully. As he read, his frown deepened. Baker spoke up again, his voice carrying false sympathy. "As you can see, Mr. Morrison made provisions for his biological son, Tommy Richardson. The DNA test has already been expedited, and I have the results here confirming paternity." He slid another paper across the table. There it was in black and white, 99.9% probability. Marcus was Tommy's father. The numbers swam before my eyes, scientific proof of 13 years of deception. "The will stipulates," Baker continued, "that 60% of the estate goes to Tommy Richardson to be held in trust until his 18th birthday with Stephanie Richardson as trustee. 30% goes to Mrs. Gloria Morrison and 10% to Stephanie Richardson for her years of single parenthood." The room went silent except for the ticking of Harrison's antique clock. I stared at the document, at what appeared to be Marcus's signature at the bottom. It looked right, but felt wrong, like looking at a photograph where something imperceptible has been altered. "There are also 2 witnesses," Baker added, pointing to the signatures. "James Chen and Maria Gonzalez, both notaries public in the state of Massachusetts." Harrison cleared his throat. "I'd like time to verify this document's authenticity. This is quite different from the estate planning Marcus and I discussed just last year." "By all means," Baker said smoothly. "But my client is prepared to file for immediate execution of the will. Tommy has educational needs, medical expenses. Every day of delay impacts a child's welfare." Stephanie had been quiet until now, but she leaned forward, her eyes meeting mine. "Gloria, Marcus wanted this. He told me he couldn't leave this world without providing for his son. You still get the house, 30% of his investments, his pension, survivor benefits. It's not like you're being left with nothing." "Nothing," I repeated, my voice finally finding strength. "You think this is about money? You slept with my husband, had his child, lied to me for 13 years, and now you want to take 60% of everything we built together. Everything you built." Stephanie's mask slipped, showing the bitterness beneath. "You lived in a beautiful house, took vacations to Europe, wore designer clothes, all while I struggled to pay rent. Marcus was supporting Tommy secretly, yes, but it was pennies compared to what you enjoyed. Don't you think his actual child deserves his inheritance more than his wife who couldn't give him children?" The cruelty of her words hit like physical blows. Harrison held up his hand before I could respond. Ms. Richardson, I suggest you let your attorney speak for you. Gloria, we need to discuss this privately. Mr. Baker will be in touch within 48 hours. After they left, Harrison turned to me with concern. Gloria, something feels wrong about this. Marcus never mentioned changing his will, and he told me everything. Just last month we had lunch, and he spoke about surprising you for your anniversary. A man planning his future with his wife doesn't secretly disinherit her. Can you prove it's fake? I asked, hope creeping into my voice. I'll need time to investigate. The signatures could be forged, the witnesses might not be legitimate. But if it's real, if Marcus really did this, we'll need to consider contesting based on undue influence or lack of capacity. I left his office with more questions than answers. The Marcus I knew would never have done this behind my back. But then again, the Marcus I knew wouldn't have had a secret child either. I drove home to our empty house, every room echoing with memories now tainted by doubt. His office still smelled like his cologne papers scattered across his desk from his last morning alive. I began searching through everything: drawers, files, computer documents, looking for any hint of this new will. His laptop was password protected, but I knew all his passwords, or thought I did. None worked. When had he changed them? His filing cabinet contained copies of our original will insurance policies, investment statements, but nothing about amendments or changes. His email showed nothing unusual, just work correspondence and Amazon receipts for household items. In desperation, I called Robert Chen, Marcus's best friend and business partner. Robert answered on the first ring, his voice full of concern. Gloria, how are you holding up? I've been meaning to call, but I didn't want to intrude. Robert, did Marcus ever mention anything about Tommy being his son or changing his will? The silence stretched long enough that I knew the answer before he spoke. Tommy, Stephanie's boy, Gloria, what are you talking about? I explained everything, my words tumbling over each other. Robert listened without interrupting, then sighed heavily. Gloria, Marcus, and I talked about everything. Every major decision, every concern, every guilt. If Tommy was his son, I would have known. Hell, he spent months agonizing over buying a boat without consulting you. He wouldn't have hidden a child. But the DNA test confirms it, I said weakly. DNA doesn't lie, but Marcus wouldn't have hidden this from me. And changing his will without telling you, impossible. Last month he asked me to recommend a jewelry designer. He was having a special piece made for your 16th anniversary. Does that sound like a man planning to blindside his wife? After hanging up, I sat in Marcus's chair, surrounded by the life we'd built together. Photos covered the walls, our wedding vacations, family gatherings, 15 years of memories. In every picture, Marcus looked at me like I was his whole world. But apparently that world had included secrets I never imagined. The next morning I made a decision that Marcus would have been proud of. Instead of wallowing, I took action. I hired Catherine Walsh, a private investigator recommended by Harrison. Catherine was in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that inspired confidence. We met at a coffee shop downtown, away from anywhere Stephanie might see us. I need to know everything about this will, I told her, sliding copies of all the documents across the table. The witnesses, the notary, when and where it was supposedly signed. And I need to know about Stephanie's finances, her relationship with this lawyer, Baker, everything. Catherine studied the papers, making notes in a leather journal. The witness names are interesting. James Chen is a common name, but Maria Gonzalez even more so. Could be real people, could be fabricated. The notary seal looks authentic, but those can be forged or stolen. What raises my suspicion is the timing. 6 months ago. What was happening in your lives then? I thought back. Marcus had just landed the Riverside Tower project, his biggest ever. He was stressed but happy. We'd booked a trip to Italy for this summer to celebrate. My voice cracked on the word summer, a season we'd never share. And Stephanie. What was her situation 6 months ago? She'd lost her job at the restaurant, asked Marcus for a loan to cover rent. He gave her $5,000, said she didn't need to pay it back. I remember being annoyed because it wasn't the first time. Catherine nodded, writing rapidly. Financial desperation is a powerful motivator. I'll start with Baker. If this will is fabricated, he's either complicit or being used. Either way, his reputation will tell us something. Over the next week, Catherine uncovered a web of concerning information. Daniel Baker had been reprimanded by the Bar Association twice for ethics violations involving estate disputes. He specialized in contingency cases, taking a percentage of winnings rather than upfront payment, which explained how Stephanie afforded him. More interesting was that Stephanie had been seen entering Baker's office 4 months ago, 2 months before the supposed will was created. The witnesses proved even more intriguing. James Chen existed, but he was Stephanie's ex-boyfriend from 2 years ago, someone she'd dated briefly after her divorce. He worked at a shipping company and had no notary license. Maria Gonzalez was a ghost, no record of her in the Massachusetts notary database, no address, no phone number, no digital footprint at all. Catherine also discovered Stephanie's financial situation was dire. She owed $60,000 in credit card debt, was 3 months behind on rent, and had been sued by Tommy's orthodontist for non-payment. Her bank records, which Catherine obtained through methods she didn't elaborate on, showed multiple calls to Baker's office and searches for contesting wills Massachusetts and inheritance rights biological children, dating back 6 months. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Catherine had contacted Marcus's secretary Linda, who'd worked with him for 8 years. Linda revealed that Stephanie had been coming to the office frequently in the past 6 months, always when Marcus was out. She'd claimed to be picking up things Marcus left for her, using his computer to print documents for Tommy's school applications. Linda had thought it strange, but hadn't questioned it since Marcus had always been generous with Stephanie. She had access to his office, his computer, possibly his signatures on other documents she could trace, Catherine explained. Security footage shows her there the week before Marcus died, spending 2 hours alone in his office while he was in Chicago. Armed with this information, I met with Harrison again. He'd done his own investigation consulting with handwriting experts who found inconsistencies in Marcus's signature on the new will. The slant was wrong, the pressure points different from his authenticated signatures. Not enough for court proof, perhaps, but enough to raise doubts. We need to confront them with what we know, Harrison advised. Sometimes the threat of criminal prosecution for fraud is enough to make people fold. But before we could arrange another meeting, something unexpected happened. Tommy showed up at my door alone on a Thursday evening. He stood on my porch, looking so much like Marcus in the fading light that my heart stuttered. Those green eyes, the shape of his nose, even the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot when nervous. "Aunt Gloria, can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. I let him in, this boy who was living proof of my husband's betrayal, but who was also just a child caught in adult deceptions. We sat in the kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals for Marcus, where we'd shared morning coffee and evening wine, where we'd dreamed about the children we'd never have. "Mom's been acting weird." Tommy began fidgeting with his backpack zipper. "She keeps telling me about all the things we're going to buy when we get Dad's money. I mean Marcus's money. I mean your money." He looked miserable, confused by the pronouns of his complicated reality. "What kind of things?" I asked, gently pushing a glass of milk and cookies toward him, the aunt instinct overriding my anger at his mother. "A house, a car, private school for me. She's already been looking at places online. But Aunt Gloria, I don't want those things. I just wanted a dad." His voice broke on the last word, and suddenly he was crying, this 12-year-old boy who'd lost the father he'd barely been allowed to know. I moved around the table, wrapping my arms around him while he sobbed. He smelled like teenage boy Axe body spray and laundry detergent, but also something indefinable that reminded me of Marcus. How many times had Marcus hugged him in secret? How many father-son moments had they stolen while I remained oblivious? "Your mom says Marcus left everything to me in his will," Tommy continued through his tears. "But that doesn't feel right. He told me last time I saw him that he was going to make things right with you, that he wanted to tell you the truth, so we could all be a family properly. He said you'd be a great stepmom once you got over being mad." My heart cracked at that. Marcus had been planning to tell me to risk our marriage for honesty finally, but he'd run out of time, leaving us all in this mess of half-truths and forged documents. Tommy, did your mom ever talk about the will before Marcus died? He pulled back, wiping his nose on his sleeve. Yeah, actually. She was on the phone with someone a few weeks ago saying something about how it needed to be perfect, that no one could know until after. I thought she meant after my birthday or something. This was it, the confirmation that Stephanie had been planning this before Marcus's death. But looking at Tommy's tear-stained face, I realized something. He was an innocent victim in all of this, just as much as I was. Maybe more so, because at least I'd had 15 years of real marriage, while he'd had 12 years of a father who could only love him in shadows. Tommy, I need you to understand something, I said carefully. No matter what happens with the will or the money, you're Marcus's son. That's real, and it matters. But your mom might have done something illegal to try to get money we don't have. I know, he whispered. I heard her practicing Marcus's signature. She said it was for permission slips, but she had these old documents spread out, copying from them. Would you be willing to tell the lawyers that— He nodded solemnly. Marcus would want me to tell the truth. He always said integrity was doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. That sounded exactly like Marcus, and I had to blink back my own tears. Here was his son, the child I desperately wanted to give him, raised by another woman, but carrying his values nonetheless. The confrontation came 2 days later in Harrison's office. Stephanie arrived with Baker confidence radiating from her designer outfit that I now knew she couldn't afford. Tommy was there too, sitting beside me at his own request. Catherine had provided Harrison with a folder thick with evidence, though we hadn't revealed Tommy's willingness to testify yet. Harrison began formally, his courtroom voice filling the room. Ms. Richardson, Mr. Baker, we've conducted a thorough investigation into the will you've presented. We have significant concerns about its authenticity. Baker started to object, but Harrison continued. James Chen has confirmed he never witnessed any will signing. He hasn't seen Ms. Richardson in over a year. Maria Gonzalez doesn't exist in any notary database in Massachusetts or any neighboring state. Stephanie's face paled, but she remained silent. Baker shifted uncomfortably, perhaps beginning to realize he'd been drawn into something darker than expected. Furthermore, Harrison continued pulling out security footage stills. We have evidence of Ms. Richardson accessing Marcus Morrison's office without authorization, using his computer and practicing his signature. The forensic document examiner found 17 points of divergence between Marcus's authentic signature and the one on your will. That's circumstantial, Baker argued weakly. Perhaps. But Tommy Richardson is prepared to testify that he witnessed his mother forging Marcus's signature and discussing the will before Marcus's death. Everyone turned to look at Tommy, who straightened in his chair. It's true, he said, his young voice steady. Mom, I know you did this because you want better for us, but this isn't what Dad would have wanted. He told me he was setting up a college fund for me, not giving me everything. He loved Aunt Gloria. He wouldn't have hurt her like this. The room went silent. Stephanie stared at her son, her carefully constructed plan crumbling. Baker was already packing his briefcase, recognizing a sinking ship when he saw one. Stephanie, I said, surprising myself by speaking, I know you're desperate. I know raising Tommy alone has been hard. But this isn't the answer. Forging legal documents is a felony. You could go to prison. You have everything. Stephanie burst out, tears streaming down her face. The perfect house, the perfect marriage, the perfect life. Even now, even knowing Marcus cheated with me, you still had 15 years of happiness. What did I have? One night that ruined my life. A son I couldn't even acknowledge properly, watching from the sidelines while you lived the life I wanted. You had a son, I replied quietly. The one thing I wanted most in the world you had. And Marcus made sure you were provided for, just not publicly. Every check he wrote, every bill he paid, that was him taking care of his responsibilities. But this is theft. Harrison intervened. Here's what's going to happen. Ms. Richardson, you're going to withdraw any claim to Marcus Morrison's estate beyond what he was already providing in monthly support. You're going to sign a confession about forging the will which will hold, but not file unless you ever attempt something like this again. In exchange, Mrs. Morrison won't press criminal charges." "That's blackmail," Baker protested. "That's mercy," Harrison corrected. "Your client committed fraud. We're offering her a way to avoid prison for her son's sake." Stephanie looked at Tommy, who was quietly crying beside me. "I'm sorry," she whispered to him. "I just wanted to give you everything." "I had everything," Tommy replied. "I had Uncle Marcus teaching me baseball, Aunt Gloria helping with homework when you were working a family, even if it was complicated. Now I've lost all of that because you got greedy." The documents were drawn up and signed within an hour. Stephanie relinquished all claims to Marcus's estate. In return, I agreed not to pursue criminal charges. I also made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I would continue Marcus's support of Tommy, paying for his education and expenses until he turned 18. Not because I had to, but because it's what Marcus would have wanted, and because Tommy deserved better than being punished for his mother's crimes. As they prepared to leave, Stephanie turned to me one last time. "I know you'll never forgive me." "You're right," I admitted. "I won't. But Tommy is Marcus's son, and I won't punish him for your choices or Marcus's. He's welcome in my home at family gatherings in whatever way he feels comfortable. But you and we're done." Baker left without a word, probably calculating how to distance himself from the situation. Tommy hugged me tightly before leaving, whispering "thank you" against my shoulder. Stephanie walked out with her head down, defeated but not destroyed, which was more grace than she'd offered me. The weeks following the confrontation were a blur of grief and adjustment. I found Marcus's real plans in a safety deposit box I hadn't known existed, along with a letter dated just a week before his death. His hands had trembled while writing it, I could tell from the shaky penmanship. "My dearest Gloria," it began. "If you're reading this, then I've run out of time to tell you the truth myself. Tommy is my son. 13 years ago, in the worst moment of our separation, I made the worst mistake of my life. I've been a coward every day since, too afraid of losing you to confess. But I can't leave this world without making things right." The letter went on to explain how he'd been setting up a trust fund for Tommy's education separate from our joint assets. He'd never intended to take from our marriage to provide for his son. He'd been working extra hours, taking on additional projects to fund it himself. The Riverside Tower project bonus was going entirely into Tommy's college fund. He wanted to tell me everything after our Italy trip, hoping the distance and beauty might soften the blow. "I know you'll be angry," he wrote. "You have every right to be. But please don't punish Tommy or Stephanie for my weakness. I love you more than words can express. You are my heart, my soul, my everything. Tommy is my responsibility, but you are my choice every single day for 15 years. Please forgive me. Please find a way to be happy again." I sat in our bedroom holding that letter, sobbing for the man who'd loved me imperfectly but completely. The Marcus I'd married would never have secretly disinherited me because he'd wanted me to be part of every decision, even the hard ones. He'd just run out of time to include me in this one. I started seeing a grief counselor, Dr. Sarah Winters, who specialized in complicated loss. "You're grieving multiple things," she explained during our third session. "The death of your husband, the death of your image of your marriage, the death of your relationship with your sister, and perhaps most complicated, the death of the children you never had while processing the existence of the child he did have." She was right. Seeing Tommy was like looking at a ghost of what might have been. But slowly I began to separate my anger at Marcus and Stephanie from my feelings toward him. He was a good kid, smart and kind with Marcus's sense of humor and surprising emotional intelligence for his age. He started coming over on Saturdays first, just for an hour or two, then staying longer. We worked on his homework together, and I found myself enjoying teaching him the way I did my third graders. He had Marcus's analytical mind, but also an artistic streak that must have come from Stephanie. We didn't talk about Marcus at first, the wound too fresh for both of us. But one Saturday, about 2 months after the funeral, Tommy brought a box of photographs. "Mom doesn't know I have these," he admitted. "Dad, I mean, Marcus gave them to me. Pictures of us together. We spread them across the kitchen table, this secret history of father and son. Marcus teaching Tommy to ride a bike in a park I didn't recognize. The two of them at a baseball game matching caps and grins. Tommy's science fair with Marcus standing proudly beside his volcano project. Birthday parties in restaurant private rooms where I'd thought Marcus was at client dinners. He talked about you constantly, Tommy said, tracing a photo with his finger. Every time we were together, he'd tell me stories about you, how you met your wedding trips you took. It was like he needed to include you even when you weren't there. That must have been confusing for you, I said gently. Not really. I understood he loved you most. I was like this separate part of his life that didn't quite fit anywhere. Mom always said it was complicated, and it was, but at least I had him sometimes. Now I don't have him at all. We cried together, then this strange pair united by loss. I found myself holding him, this boy, who should have been mine, but wasn't, who was Marcus's, but secretly who existed in the liminal space between truth and lie. Meanwhile, Stephanie struggled. Without the prospect of an inheritance windfall, she faced her mountain of debt alone. She took a second job, moved to a smaller apartment, sold everything valuable she owned. Pride prevented her from asking me for help beyond what I'd agreed to provide for Tommy. The few times we crossed paths at Tommy's school events, we maintained icy politeness for his sake. But I noticed changes in her too. The therapy I'd required as part of our agreement seemed to be working. She looked humbler, less bitter, more focused on Tommy's well-being than her own grievances. She'd stopped drinking, Tommy mentioned, and was attending support groups for codependency. Maybe losing everything had forced her to confront who she'd become. 6 months after Marcus's death, I finally went through his closet. Each shirt still smelled like him, that mixture of cedar cologne and something uniquely Marcus. I found cards I'd given him over the years in his jacket pockets, worn soft from handling. He'd carried our love with him everywhere, even while carrying secrets. In his desk drawer beneath financial papers, I found a journal he'd kept sporadically. The entries about Tommy were tortured, full of self-recrimination and fear. "I'm a coward," he'd written repeatedly. "Gloria deserves better. Tommy deserves better. I'm failing everyone I love." But there were other entries too about our life together. "Gloria made me laugh until I cried today. Watching Gloria with her students reminds me why I fell in love with her. 15 years and she still takes my breath away. I don't deserve her forgiveness, but I'll spend my life trying to earn it." Reading his private thoughts was like having one last conversation with him. He'd been planning to confess, had written and rewritten speeches trying to find words that might soften the blow. He'd researched marriage counselors who specialized in infidelity and secret children. He'd even looked into family therapy that could include Tommy. He'd wanted to fix everything, to blend our broken pieces into something whole. The Riverside Tower project was completed 8 months after his death. Robert invited me to the dedication ceremony where they'd named the atrium after Marcus. I stood with Tommy and surprisingly Stephanie as they unveiled a plaque with Marcus's name and the quote he'd lived by, "Build with integrity, create with passion, live with purpose." Tommy read a speech about his father that he'd written himself, talking about the man who taught him to always do the right thing even when it was hard. He didn't mention the secrecy, the complications, just the love of a father who'd tried his best in impossible circumstances. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Afterward, Stephanie approached me tentatively. "Thank you for letting us be here," she said. "I know you didn't have to include us." "Marcus would have wanted Tommy here," I replied. "This is his legacy too." She nodded, then surprised me by adding, "I've been seeing someone, a good man, nothing like before. He knows everything about Tommy, about Marcus, about what I did. He says everyone deserves a second chance." "I hope it works out," I said, meaning it. Not for her sake, but for Tommy's. He deserved a stable, happy home. As the first anniversary of Marcus's death approached, I realized something had shifted in me. The acute pain had dulled to a chronic ache. I could remember happy moments without immediately dissolving into tears. I'd started teaching art classes for underprivileged kids at the community center, channeling my need to nurture into something positive. Marcus would have been proud. Tommy had become a regular part of my life by then, spending weekends with me calling for help with homework, sharing his teenage dramas and dreams. He wanted to be an architect like Marcus, and I'd given him Marcus's old drafting tools, watching him trace the same lines his father once had. One evening, as we worked on his geometry homework at the kitchen table, Tommy asked, "Do you think Dad would be okay with how things turned out?" I considered the question carefully. I think he'd be grateful that we found a way to be a family, even if it's not the way anyone expected. "Do you forgive him?" Tommy asked, his green eyes. Marcus's eyes searching mine. "I'm working on it," I answered honestly. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a choice you make every day, sometimes every hour. Some days I manage it, others I'm still angry, but I loved him more than I was hurt by him, and that has to count for something. Now, a full year after that horrible day at the cemetery, I stand at Marcus's grave with fresh flowers. The headstone is simple, elegant, the way he would have wanted it. "Beloved husband, father, friend," it reads. Father. I'd fought against including that word initially, but Tommy deserved to see it there, deserved that acknowledgement of what Marcus had been to him. The cemetery is peaceful in the spring afternoon, birds singing in the oak trees that Marcus would have loved. I arrange the flowers carefully. Red roses for love, white lilies for rebirth, yellow daffodils for new beginnings. As I stand, I see two figures approaching, Tommy and surprisingly Stephanie. "We didn't plan this," Stephanie says quickly. "We can leave if you want." I shake my head. We all have a right to grieve him, complicated as that grief might be. We stand together, this unlikely trio bound by one man's life and death. Tommy places a baseball beside the headstone from his championship game last week. Stephanie adds a small stone painted with the word "forgiven," though I'm not sure if it's meant for Marcus or herself. "He wasn't perfect," I say, breaking the silence. "But he was ours in different ways, and that has to be enough." We don't stay long, but as we walk back to our cars, Tommy asks if he can come for dinner. I say yes, then surprise myself by inviting Stephanie too. She hesitates, then declines gracefully, saying her boyfriend is cooking tonight. But there's gratitude in her eyes, recognition that this small gesture means something. At home, Tommy and I cook Marcus's favorite meal, laughing as we burn the garlic bread, just like Marcus always did. We eat at the kitchen table where so many memories live, and for the first time it doesn't feel empty. Different, yes, but not empty. After dinner, Tommy shows me his latest architectural designs for a memorial garden he wants to create at his school in Marcus's honor. His talent is obvious, inherited from his father, but uniquely his own. As he explains his vision, I see Marcus in his enthusiasm, his attention to detail, his desire to create something lasting and beautiful. "Aunt Gloria," he says as he's leaving, "I know this isn't how anyone wanted things to be, but I'm glad I have you." "I'm glad I have you too," I reply, meaning it completely. Later, alone in my bedroom, I pull out Marcus's letter one more time. The paper is soft now from handling, tear-stained and worn. But the words that matter most stand out clearly. "Please find a way to be happy again." I am finding that way, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. Not the happiness I'd planned, not the life I'd expected, but something real nonetheless. The grief counselor says I'm doing remarkably well, that I've found meaning in the meaningless, purpose in the pain. Tomorrow I'll wake up in this house that's too big for one person, but filled with memories I'm not ready to leave. I'll teach my third graders, have lunch with friends who've stood by me through everything, maybe work on the novel I've started writing about second chances and complicated families. Tommy will call after school to tell me about his day, and I'll listen with genuine interest to this nephew-son who's become so dear to me. Life moves forward. Not in the straight line we expect, but in spirals and curves, backwards and forwards, until somehow we end up somewhere we never expected, but exactly where we need to be. Marcus is gone, but love remains, complicated, messy, imperfect love that transcends death and betrayal, and even forgiveness. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, but the capacity to forgive, to rebuild, and to find light even in the darkest betrayal. Marcus left me that without meaning to, and perhaps that's the most honest thing he ever gave me. The truth finally, even if it came too late, set us all free to become who we were meant to be. As I close my eyes tonight, I don't dream of the life I lost, but of the life I'm building from its ashes. And in that space between sleeping and waking, I swear I can feel Marcus smiling finally at peace, knowing that despite everything, we're all going to be okay. The story I've shared with you today isn't one I ever imagined telling. It's messy and painful and complicated in ways that fairy tales never prepare us for. But it's real and it's mine, and if it helps even one person navigating their own betrayal and loss, then perhaps there was purpose in the pain after all. Have you ever had to forgive something that seemed unforgivable? How did you find your way back to peace? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to support others who might need to hear that they're not alone in their complicated grief. Share this with someone who needs to know that healing is possible even when forgiveness feels impossible. Thank you for listening to my journey, for holding space for my pain and my healing. May you find peace in your own struggles, strength in your own storms, and remember that sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow from the most broken ground. Until next time, remember that you are stronger than you know, braver than you feel, and never ever alone in your journey toward healing.